Be coming in a little bit late. I think the weather and everything else is.
Manners.
I have a feeling we're moving a little slowly because even online we're gathering people slowly, and I think the doors upstairs being closed has not been helpful. So we'll start off because I know that the people who did come here on time want to get home at some point, and then hopefully. People will join in the next few minutes if they're running a bit late. Thank you all for coming. This is our information night for the Take Action Group, and we have tonight's theme is about trafficking in modern slavery, and we have two amazing speakers, Catherine Baldacchino. Catherine Baldacchino, who is working as the anti-trafficking program manager with the British Red Cross, and Jane Hunt, who is Senior Medical Officer with Helen Bamber. And I'm going to let them kind of say a few words about their own background rather than me reading it off their bios, because that's always more interesting to hear people talk about themselves. And then kind of launch into what they're going to talk about. We did a kind of a survey at the beginning of the year of what people were interested in terms of information topics, and this was one of the ones that kind of got the highest scores. So I think it's been a long time coming, and we're very excited to be talking about it. And bear in mind that at the beginning of every year we do a survey of what people would like to hear about. So think about what kind of topics you would like to know more about, and if there are any things that kind of flag up issues that you think would be interesting to learn more about tonight as well. Maybe just make a note, and then we can look at next year what we end up putting on the agenda, because this is our last of these events for this year. So I will leave it there, and I will invite Catherine to come up and speak.
Brilliant. Thank you. Hi everyone. I am Catherine. Really lovely to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I work at the British Red Cross, so I'm the anti-trafficking program manager, as Claire mentioned, and so that it means that I manage our work both in the UK and internationally. So we've got UK programs. We're supporting people who have been trafficked in various parts of the UK through casework support, complex casework, through mainstreaming, more trafficking awareness within existing Red Cross programs, because as you can imagine, we've got a lot of very wide and varied programs, so we're trying to increase awareness and provisions in that. And we do policy work, research and advocacy as well in the UK. Internationally, we're working with other Red Cross, Red Crescent partners to help build their capacity to recognise and respond to trafficking in their contexts. So my team's kind of all over the place. I've got half my team in Bangladesh and Myanmar at the moment, and half my team sitting here in London and around the UK. So I thought I would just give a bit of a whistle-stop tour of a trafficking introduction. I'm sure many are familiar with the definition and the terms, but just for everybody, I thought I'll just go through everything in any case. Please feel free to stop me and ask any questions. I don't necessarily only want you to wait till the end, so please, if something's not clear, then just interject. Otherwise, we were reflecting that I can definitely talk till I'm blue in the face, so please stop me and ask as I go along. So I'm going to be covering trafficking, what it is, and then a little bit more about global trends and things that we're seeing through the Red Cross and wider, specifically about vulnerabilities that people have and why trafficking is occurring in those instances. And then I'll cover a little bit about what's happening in the UK, which I'm sure is really relevant for your roles as well. So, so we've got the human trafficking definition. Now, obviously, there's an international definition that we tend to rely on and use, but obviously it will always depend on local legislation and local interpretation. So the definition of trafficking does vary depending on context, but it is internationally agreed that this is more or less the definition. So trafficking is the recruitment or movement of people by means of coercion, deception or force for the purpose of exploitation. And this has been identified and created through the Palermo Protocol, which is the most referenced definition of trafficking. It's longer. It does talk about many other factors: recruitment, transportation, harbouring, receipt of persons. Often when we talk about trafficking, people very much focus on the movement and the fact that movement needs to have happened, and that sometimes overshadows the exploitation. So we tend to now take less of a focus on the movement and more of a focus on the exploitation that has happened, so the purpose of exploitation. But there's an easier to reference charts which ICMPD use, and they're a really good resource for other info if you do want to do any additional reading on trafficking. And so they've helpfully drawn it out as the act, the means, and the purpose. So the acts being recruitment, transportation, transferring, harbouring, or receipt. So again, sometimes people define it as if you haven't done the movement yourself, if you haven't actually physically transported the person, then you haven't been involved in trafficking, but it can still be the case if you've even opened your door and allowed somebody in who has been trafficked. The means are really important, and I'll go into the means more in other slides, but the means that people use to control people are force, coercion, abduction, abuse of power, abuse of authority. So it's quite a longer list of ways, and again, we tend to focus, especially I guess in the media and in films, portrayals of trafficking, often the kidnapping or the abduction, but there's often very subtle forms of coercion that are at play as well. Instances of people becoming boyfriends with women in order to move them, or sometimes parents being involved. So there's many different means. And for the purpose of exploitation, and I will get into exploitation on the next slide. I think just to highlight that exploitation really is a huge continuum, and so we do have many different forms of exploitation, many different extremes, and so we do have instances, we see this in the UK, of people working for minimal pay, so well below the minimum wage, without the right safety equipment, without the right provisions to protect themselves, and so that's definitely on the scale of exploitation, but that's one side of things, and then it comes all the way into the much more slavery-like, much more aggressive and forceful and locked-in situations as well. So it is a huge continuum that we face within the sector. Unhelpfully, though, exploitation isn't clearly defined. There isn't an agreed definition of exploitation. So it means that the definition that we do use, I'll go back to that slide there. So the Palermo Protocol lists out the forms of exploitation that it recognises. So labour exploitation, slavery, servitude, sexual exploitation, removal of organs, and then other forms not listed here. So it tries to take the approach of listing the forms as opposed to defining what exploitation is. And so again, there's many different attempts to try to define exploitation, but I won't spend time on that here. So the reason I mentioned the means before, it's really important because if the means are actually completely irrelevant for people who are under 18, obviously because the consent that they're able to give under 18 are irrelevant. So for child trafficking, you just need to demonstrate the act and the purpose, regardless of what means or whether you can evidence the means. And often there's a use of trafficking and smuggling almost interchangeably as a term, and I guess I'm confident that we all understand that that's different, and it's different helpfully again through ICMPD's chart. It comes to the type of crime that it is, and the relationship to the smuggler, and ultimately, in its most crude form, I guess, smuggling is a business transaction where someone has paid to be transported from A to B, and once they get to B, then their connections to the person that has moved them or has sold them that journey are no longer tying them at all. There's no new debt that they have to pay off, or they're completely free to walk away from that smuggler. There is quite a continuum though of where smuggling becomes exploitative and can definitely become trafficking, and that has happened in many instances as well. So again, there's a bit of a grey, blurry line between all of it.
Could I just ask?
Yeah.
Is it an internationally accepted definition that children are under 18 for this purpose?
Yeah.
So that's accepted by all countries, is what I'm trying to say.
I see. Yeah, good point. So there is differences in that. So yes, anyone that's signed on to the Palermo Protocol has defined it as being 18. Yeah. Do you have more to that?
No, that it's a lot of the countries that did sign the UN, so United Nations Palermo Protocol. So it is a huge number of countries that have signed that. But yes, there'll be many that won't have and don't even have legislation about modern slavery or human trafficking. There's much more of a push at the moment to get a wider sort of international definition across all sort of realms of trafficking. But obviously, there's also countries that don't sign.
Yeah.
Difficult if going to legislation defines an adult as someone younger than 18, which some countries do.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. The general push is to make it 18 amongst all countries.
Yeah, and it's often the challenges, and that's often a protection gap for people as well in countries. So in Bangladesh, they haven't signed the Palermo Protocol. They do have local law, the MSHTU, that does use the Palermo Protocol's definition, but the age is still a challenge in Bangladesh, and that's where we're seeing a big gap in protection of 17-year-olds, 16 to 17-year-olds that kind of fall between different laws, and lawyers are trying to find ways to sort of piece together different pieces of legislation to provide protection. So modern slavery is a term that you will have heard in the UK. It's incredibly unpopular outside of the UK. People have very mixed feelings on it. It's definitely the Vegemite of the trafficking world, or Marmite rather, love it or hate it, but it is an umbrella term. Well, no, there's discussion about whether it's an umbrella term or not, but it tends to be used as a more broader way of defining all forms of slavery and slavery-like practices, and trafficking being one of those things. So ILO, for example, and in a lot of the ILO statistics that come out include forced labour and forced marriage. Also, forced marriage doesn't always fall under the definition of trafficking, and again, that really depends on local contexts and how it's been defined. So, yeah, there's some debate about modern slavery, but it's definitely a term that you're going to have heard.
So, why is it unpopular outside the UK?
Pardon?
Why is it unpopular? An unpopular term outside the UK?
I guess there's been I think for a lot of different reasons. I think it's very difficult to define and understand in contexts that don't have English as a first language as well. So the concepts, it feels when you're speaking to, like I work a lot with my European Red Cross colleagues, and they sort of very much feel it's a very UK imposed term. There's other distinctions though as well about the modern factor of the term as well. So there's a lot of...
It's the word slavery that people really don't like, whereas we are sort of have adopted it in the UK because it gets people's attention. So I think that's the benefit of it. So we've got the Modern Slavery Act now, we've got the Modern Slavery Commissioner, governments sit up, funders sit up, because it is such an emotive topic. So, and that obviously works in two ways.
Yeah.
I'm sure Theresa May likes it.
Theresa May likes it, exactly. So, yes.
Makes it unpopular with me.
Which could be, reason enough.
She likes fighting it, but she likes...
She likes the term.
She likes the term.
She likes the term.
And fighting it, yeah.
Well, and she likes fighting it as well.
So
It's
if
one of
they're
her
using
things.
this term in Europe or other parts of the world, what are they using instead?
Just more commonly trafficking.
And the definitions are really slightly different everywhere. So even those who've signed the UN Palermo Protocol. So for example, you've seen all the headlines about Prince Andrew supposedly trafficked, he had a young girl trafficked to him. That's because in America, child sexual exploitation of any sort, of child sexual abuse, is considered trafficking. So there's these little nuances and definitions everywhere. What I've started to do when I'm teaching is I just use this very long-winded thing. I go very quickly, modern slavery, human trafficking. So it's sort of covering everything, because it's so, and I work quite a lot with some Americans on a human trafficking network, whereas we might say modern slavery. So it's slightly different everywhere, but a lot of it is just legal terminology that doesn't make a massive difference unless you are fighting an immigration case or an MRM case.
So you're not necessarily working with slavery where the person hasn't been trafficked. They're treated as a slave and been trafficked.
I work with people that are victims of slavery, so forced labour, and I think that's the case with the Red Cross and everybody. We don't distinguish too hard about that, so which is why I lump the two terms together, human trafficking, modern slavery.
Yeah.
As you said, that the actual movement isn't the important bit.
No.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
And as you said earlier, a lot of people have sort of used a people smuggler to get over here, so they've come over on their own free will, and it's then it changes, either because of that smuggler, or they get picked up on a street corner here, and then they're moved to Ipswich to work on the farms in exploitative labour situations. So actually that is human trafficking, because they've been moved from London to Ipswich for exploitative purposes. So the definitions are they're so similar for all intents and purposes. It tends not to matter that much.
Yeah. The benefit of modern slavery, though, as a term here, is that because it is broader and it does capture more, it means that the distinct definition of trafficking, act, means and purpose, does not need to be evidenced for every case. So if you can't evidence the means, if you can't evidence the acts as well, then somebody could still potentially fall under the definition and still receive some level of limited support in the UK. We'll get onto that later, but that is still available because it's a bit more of a catch-all and people can still receive that support. So there is a benefit, but just for ease of purpose, we do call ourselves the anti-trafficking team, but it is for all forms of exploitation. Right, okay, so intent to exploit is also important as part of the definition. The exploitation doesn't necessarily need to have happened yet, it's just that the intention was there. So sometimes people are intercepted before they're exploited, and
Excuse me.
that's okay, and it's still relevant as part of the definition. It's obviously harder to evidence, but it's there. It's something to be aware of, though, if you're engaging or if you've met people who might be in an exploitative situation but who haven't felt yet the full impact of that exploitation yet. They may not have yet been put in those conditions, but you can tell that something's not quite right, because people themselves won't really acknowledge it, and they either won't want the help or they won't want to come away, and consent and informed consent with adults is obviously really important for this work too. So it's just something to keep in mind in terms of whether the exploitation's happened or not yet, and the issue of consent, and it's something I will mention later when it comes to the NRM, but in this part it's about consent to be moved or consent to the condition. So in adults, we've already established that for children it's irrelevant, but for adults also, if any of the means are present, so if force was used, if coercion was used, if there was any deceit, then even if the adult consented to the situation, then it's deemed irrelevant. Their consent in that situation is deemed irrelevant. And this has happened, for example, there's been video CCTV footage of women buying their own bus tickets from Europe to come to the UK, and knew what they were coming to experience. But then once they got here, the conditions changed. It was definitely not what they had agreed to participate in. The police tried to mount a case that actually they knew what they were doing because they have footage of them buying their own tickets. They must have known what they were coming here for, and that was overturned because they definitely were not told the full extent of what was going to happen to them. Because deceit was involved, then their consent was deemed irrelevant.
So the police tried to argue that they knew what they were doing.
Yeah, the police often act as immigration enforcement in these situations, so yeah, unfortunately, but not all, of course, but in some circumstances we really have to advocate hard to demonstrate that this isn't the case.
It gets very confusing, doesn't it? Because with the Modern Slavery Act, one of the reasons why people get the support with the NRM, which we'll talk about later briefly, one of the reasons that people are given the support is so they can sort of not just rest and reflect, as it's called, but they can help with the prosecution against the traffickers. So they often have lengthy police interviews and things. But if the police decide that they're not, as you say, they become very immigration minded, and if the police decide there's no case to answer, then that often goes very negative for them in their NRM case or their asylum case, if they're doing an asylum case as well. So it's very, very tricky. And most of the people I've seen have been tricked in some way, so in some ways you could argue that they have been complicit in their arrival here. They've paid the money, but it's just what happens to them. They've been tricked, they've been lied to, they thought they were coming for a nice job working as a nanny, and they're in horrendous domestic servitude or sexual exploitation or whatever it is. So, and that's the common story.
Great. Okay, so there are long lists of indicators of trafficking. The challenge I often have with indicators is that they are created in a way that they're not always that useful for every single context and different roles. So there are indicators on here and on the next slide which do talk about situations of, for example, sexual exploitation or domestic servitude, that unless you are in the location where they're being exploited, unless you are actually in the home or in the place where somebody is being sold for sex, you wouldn't spot those indicators, you wouldn't think to know. So it's really important, and this is something that we do, or we're increasingly starting to do now as part of the Red Cross, is work with local teams to figure out what are the indicators that are more relevant for each role. And so people that are working at disembarkation points, at ports, will be looking for different things than for people that work in reception centres or the people that are delivering first aid education in other contexts. So the indicators really do need to vary, and so there are lists that you can download online, UNODC, ILO, there's a lot of resources, but it is worth putting in a bit of extra time to think about, in your situations where you will be engaging with people, what are the things that you could be looking for in those contexts. So that's just a little brief summary of that. But something worth covering is the different forms of exploitation. So of course sexual exploitation is a well recognised form of exploitation, and it's sexual exploitation for sexual services, pornography, online sexual services, escorts. So there's a full range of sexual exploitation that falls under that definition. Domestic servitude also is better recognised in the UK than in other contexts, and this is any sort of form of house help. So as Jane mentioned, taking care of children or working as a cleaner in the house, often live-in domestic services. Interesting thing about all of these forms of exploitation is that people will be free often to leave the house and will be picking up children from school and will be able to do the shopping unsupervised and alone. And again, that's a challenge sometimes for the authorities to say, well, actually the key was in the lock the whole time. You could have left, or actually you've been to the shop every single day, why didn't you leave? And that's where it comes back to the means as well, and how forcefully people are kept under control psychologically, through threats to their family, through witchcraft in some cases. So there's a lot of different forms of control, even if people are able to get out. And yeah, of course, labour exploitation. Internationally, labour exploitation is a very broad term that covers a lot of things that then sometimes get separately listed in other contexts. So labour exploitation can include also criminal exploitation, so people who are in cannabis farms, I mean literally a household, a residential house on a street anywhere in the UK will be boarded up and treated as a cannabis farm. That's more criminal exploitation, but in some definitions it falls under labour exploitation. Forced begging also falls under the definition too. So there's a lot of different forms as well. I realise I'm just really whipping through. So Ben, please let me know if you'd like me to speak about anything more further. This is what I mentioned about just more locally relevant warning signs. And this is a piece of work we did in Bangladesh really recently in Cox's Bazar. We are still continuing to work in the Rohingya refugee camp that's there, and working with the local Red Crescent and Red Cross colleagues to really identify what are the more locally relevant indicators that they might have access to. And for example, the one for me that stands out is offer to see Cox's Bazar, and often, and I'll get onto this in a later slide, but people within the camp themselves have no freedom to leave the camp unless under strict permission from the camp authorities. So they live only a few miles away from Cox's Bazar beach, which is a regionally recognised beach and resort location where a lot of Bangladeshis take their holidays, but the Rohingyas themselves have often never seen the beach and will have never visited, and so young girls are often come to authorities and just very casually say, oh, he offered to take me to the beach, he's offering to show me this amazing resort location. And that's already a warning sign that should be, okay, someone's potentially grooming this person to become a victim of trafficking. So again, there's indicators that are super locally specific that won't transpose easily to other contexts. So,
I think that whole idea of grooming is really important, and so it doesn't matter where you're talking about trafficking. In general, there's an element of grooming very frequently, whether it's the Nigerian woman who's working on the market and she's desperately poor, and the shop holder next door has said, oh, you can earn more money, my friend can take you to England, whether it's the Rochdale girls, so the in-house trafficking, whether it's the county lines trafficking with the young boys and the boat trainers, this is all this sort of deception, but the grooming, I think, is a really big, I think we all understand what grooming is, don't we? So it's sort of a good thing to sort of hang on when we're thinking about it.
Definitely, and we see that a lot. We often see that people, before wanting to come away, will often use the reasons of how they were groomed in order to define an attachment to the person that they have been trafficked by ultimately. So, oh no, he treated me really well, or she offered to put me into school, she was putting me into school. So there's lots of very nuanced, very challenging things to unravel around that, and especially if you're talking about people who already have varying factors of vulnerability through poverty, through exclusion, through other things. If someone's been able to buy them things or give them things that they don't have access to elsewhere, it's a very tricky thing to let go of, and a very difficult thing to unravel and disentangle the person from. So it's a good thing to keep in mind. Okay, so globally, it's obviously really difficult to get good figures on trafficking, and for so many reasons. It's obviously by its very nature a hidden and underground crime. There's also just practical challenges of the definition changes from country to country, so the way the authorities will recognise and record cases will vary, and so the categories differ, whether something's trafficking in one country or not will differ. So even just on that level, databases don't match up, but also authorities aren't always aware of it. It could be happening under people's noses and it's just not identified. There might not be any official systems to recognise and support people who have been trafficked, and often people themselves won't self-identify or won't either consent or agree to enter systems which then start to record the data that's connected to that. So it is incredibly challenging, but there are some attempts at recording the numbers. So the number that's most often used nowadays is the ILO's 40.3 million people at any time are in a situation of modern slavery. And again, remembering ILO's definition is broader So it does encompass a wider definition. 1 in 4 globally are children and 71% are women. And again, this is a recognised, recorded figures. It could in reality be very different, and it could be that, we know that authorities have a bias already to identifying and detecting women. Because it's what they've been trained to do, and that's part of the recognition of what trafficking is in terms of sexual exploitation as well. So it's happening that the statistics are showing that also. So sexual exploitation is still the most commonly identified, followed by forced labour. So that's further stats. But then if you start to drill down into more regional statistics, South Asia, for example, 50% of identified cases were sexual exploitation, followed by 49% labour, so it's starting to more equally balance. 31% children, so that's not that dissimilar from global figures. But 94% of people trafficked within South Asia were trafficked internally within borders, so domestic trafficking of Bangladeshis within Bangladesh or Filipinos within the Philippines. The caveat to this data, though, is that only Bangladesh, the Maldives, Nepal and Sri Lanka report to UNODC about their statistics. So these figures are really not representative of the entire region, but of 4 countries within that region. And that is just a challenge that we face in the sector. So I was conscious of time, and I did say I could talk forever for a few more minutes.
And the worry is, so can I.
Yeah.
Nobody's going home tonight.
Trafficking trends in Cox's Bazar, I've already touched on them briefly, so again I just thought I'd do a little bit of a whistle stop of the different contexts and the different types of vulnerabilities. So in the camps, I've already mentioned people are not free to leave, people are undocumented, people are not going through any refugee or asylum process, so there's no prospect for longer term status, there's no prospect for eventual citizenship or any form of documentation. So effectively, if people, and there's no ability to have any cash, there's no benefits or payments to people in these settings. So it means that pardon? And they're not allowed to work. Exactly. So it means that people are relying on organisations to provide their food and their material assistance, which means, of course, what's the byproduct of that? People need to be able to work, people need to be able to earn a livelihood, and so they're taking offers of work locally within the area. Further afield in Bangladesh, we haven't seen a huge amount, but it could be the case, but we haven't seen a huge amount of international travel, but there are some instances of some pathways outside of Bangladesh. But yeah, women, men are vulnerable, children are incredibly vulnerable as well. There is no sort of law enforcement that's really that effective or active, and criminal networks can act with impunity in these settings. So it does mean, I mean, at night, humanitarian actors leave the camp by 5 p.m. every day. It's not safe, but 1 million people still live there each night. So it's a really challenging situation, and it's really difficult to address, but it is an incredible example of the level of vulnerability that people can be in to end up in situations of exploitation and trafficking. And I mentioned going to something as innocent as never seeing the beach and taking offers to go and see the beach. So it is a challenge, and it's layered over with local challenges anyway. So Bangladeshis themselves are incredibly vulnerable. Cox's Bazar is a tourist hub, and there's a local issue of sexual exploitation already happening in Cox's Bazar, so it's all kind of layered on top of each other, so it is incredibly challenging. But unless anyone has any questions about Cox's Bazar, I will move to another context. Great. So Claire will remember this report. at the British Red Cross, Claire worked on this piece of research about the journey that people make through the central Mediterranean route, so the route that then leads from west, in this case West Africa, through North Africa and into Malta and Italy via boats. And it was a broader piece of research about migration and the challenges and the vulnerabilities that people face on that route, but of course within that, trafficking was a common trend and thread that ran through it all. And I think key to note is that people's reasons for travel obviously will always vary, and there are so many different reasons. So it's what often people call the mixed flow. So people are leaving for lots of different reasons. Either they are refugees, or they're leaving because of poverty, or they're leaving because of indiscriminate violence, or whatever the factor might be. So people are in a very mixed setting, but the journey is extremely long. It's extremely dangerous. People are often put in situations where they're stuck for periods of time, and some of the testimony was that people, these kids, they're not willing to wait, and it could mean waiting in a UNHCR camp for years. And I've met young people who were born in camps and then have made the journeys themselves as 18-year-olds, because their families have been stuck in camps for so long, and resettlement is available to so few people. And so with that prospect ahead, then people decide to take, or people are compelled rather, to take quite dangerous routes to get themselves out of that. We often find that measures that are in place to prevent migration, to try to keep people where they are often a risk factor for trafficking as well. So the harsher the immigration policies become, the harsher the border controls become, traffickers have a field day at capitalising on people who are compelled to move and will take these sorts of options. So a lot of our work and advocacy is around opening more safe migration channels and creating more firewalls in countries where people can report abuses safely without being treated badly by authorities or detained or incarcerated as a result. And so there were case studies that came through that, but this is just examples of some people's journey that they've made, and I encourage you to read the report. It's on the Red Cross website. And there is a correlation, of course, between war and trafficking as well, and ICMPD's report does evidence that in the Syrian war context, people in surrounding countries, there was a spike in incidents of trafficking. There was already issues of trafficking anyway in the areas, but war and displacement does cause a higher risk factor for trafficking too. So I'm using these examples just to demonstrate the varying types of risk factors. I have focused a lot on migration though, and I just wanted to emphasize that it isn't only migration settings where this does happen, and it happens a lot with local populations as well, within countries. An example in Croatia is that actually the highest percentage of people who have trafficked identified in Croatia are Croatians themselves. So, and the UK, British nationals are third on the overall list and first on the children's list of people who have been trafficked in terms of precedence and numbers of cases identified. That's connected to other factors too, because of county lines cases that we've mentioned, but there's domestic trafficking happening too. So I just want to very briefly end on what is available for people in the UK, but do you want to cover that, or do you want me to follow you at the end?
Yeah, maybe it might follow through if we just
do it that way.
Because we do a whole bit at the end on what to do.
Perfect.
Yeah.
That's much
so
easier.
We'll come back
to that.
You can do the NRA.
Great. Thanks. Thank you.
Yes, we just swap.
Yeah.
Sorry. So, my name is Jane Hunt. I'm a GP. I've been a GP in various places in inner city London for 20 years or so. I started working at the Helen Bamber Foundation on a volunteer sort of basis, 1 day a week, about 11 years ago now. Within about 4 or 5 years, I was practically full-time there. And sort of 3 or 4 years ago, I gave up my day job as an NHS GP, and I just worked purely at the Helen Bamber Foundation. So, Helen Bamber Foundation. So we were Helen Bamber was one of the founder members of Amnesty. She set up the Medical Foundation for Victims of Torture, now called Freedom from Torture. And in her late 70s, decided that Freedom from Torture, or Medical Foundation, thank you, was a little bit too state-sponsored torture dominated, and she wanted to make a more work with people with a more holistic definition of trafficking, and also a more of torture, particularly trafficking. She was beginning those 12, 14 years ago to see cases of trafficking coming through. So in summary, we are a clinical care organisation. We provide medical legal reports for asylum cases and trafficking cases, other sorts of legal advice. We have a medical advisory service where we have GPs, psychiatrists, physios who come in and help our patients manage their very complex medical issues by liaison with the NHS and things. And you'll begin to get an understanding of why that role is quite important. And we have housing and welfare team, and we have a trafficking team, and we also have psychologists. And I view it all as trying to get people who've been through awful things to a state, if you're thinking the Maslow's hierarchy, where they can then receive psychological therapy to get themselves in a position where they can be reintegrated into a normal life. So that's what we do there. So I'm bringing you back really to the UK now. We've had a really interesting tour of what goes on elsewhere, and I'm bringing you back a little bit to what we see at the Helen Bamber Foundation. What I see. What do I need to click?
You might need to
This is the mouse.
Yeah, need to move along down the bottom.
Okay.
And now you should be able to use.
So I'm going to try and cover. So I assumed because you were Médecins Sans Frontières you'd all be medics. I gather that's not quite right. But you've all, so this is rather medical, but I think it's relevant to everybody who's working with this patient group. So we're going to talk a little bit about health professionals and modern slavery, human trafficking. You can see my long thing. And a bit about vulnerability and what I call the cycle of cumulative harm, some of the medical and physical health concerns we see, and particularly what I want to concentrate on is the barriers to disclosure and access to healthcare, because that's so important for anybody who's working in a medical setting, but particularly those who are working, I think public health or setting up programs, think it's really important. Does a little bit on identifying of victims, which we've already covered, but I'll do it in a little bit more of a medical way, and a little bit about what you should do. Does that sound about right? Is that what you're going to be interested in, even if many of you, some of you, aren't actually out there medically? So one of the things I'm just going to flag up right at the beginning is safeguarding. Anybody working in this country now, it's all about safeguarding. And I think it's really, and when I'm training GPs or nurses or healthcare professionals on this, I say none of this is different. What we are looking at is working with people who are vulnerable, as you said, people who are vulnerable. And in fact, the Modern Slavery Act in 2014 defined modern slavery as one of the 10 categories of adult abuse and neglect. So I think that's a really important thing to do. This is not rocket science for any healthcare professional. We are just dealing with people who are vulnerable. The challenge is without a doubt on the global scale. We've heard a lot about that, so I think very much from a public health point of view, we're beginning to look at it a lot more. I'm not very good at this clicker. This was a really interesting study done out of King's and the Maudsley a couple of years ago. So they interviewed a whole group of healthcare professionals, GPs, midwives, A&E people, and 13% thought they had been in contact with somebody who'd been trafficked, and that went up to 20% in maternity, but 86% reported a lack of knowledge about it. I thought it was quite impressive that it was that high, to be honest with you. I thought it would be, I thought there'd be probably 90%. And very few people knew what to do about it, and definitely were unaware of the scale of human trafficking in the UK. Those that are medical here, in your practices in the UK, have you come across victims of trafficking that you've known about or suspected? Yeah. Okay. Did you suspect, identify, or did you know in the before? Yeah.
Lots of patients know about it.
Yeah. Where do you work?
Infectious disease, HIV,
Oh.
6 months a month, 6 months a month.
Okay, that's really interesting because GU was obviously but the STI type stuff is a big area where we are really wanting to get in and train, because I think a lot are presenting there. Oh, we'll have to talk about that. You can put me in contact with people that are. We know about this now. One of the things, so the different types of exploitation. So one of the things I want to just mention is that no matter what the exploitation was, so we like to talk about all the different sorts, but in fact most forms of exploitation, people are being physically and sexually abused. So for example, we know that 96% of those who'd been in domestic servitude had experienced physical abuse, and that 54% of women in domestic servitude and 21% of those who are in labour exploitation had also experienced forced sex. So I think the important thing is, again, doesn't really matter the type of exploitation. People are being abused physically, sexually, no matter what type of exploitation it is. Why can't I do this very well? You are much better.
You should be able to use the keyboard now.
Oh, should I? Excellent.
Is it going to work?
So one of the things that I think about is we touched a little bit on vulnerability. So I think these are the key words when we're thinking about patients or individuals. Vulnerability and exploitation. And I think the other really important thing is what I call the idea of cumulative harm. So most people who are trafficked have had something that makes them vulnerable happen to them in a previous life, whether that's war, forced marriage, sexual abuse, state-sponsored torture, anything somebody is fleeing from makes them vulnerable to trafficking, or makes them vulnerable to the coercion, fraud, lies, puts them in vulnerable situations. And obviously, when you're thinking about this as a healthcare professional, you can't just think about what's happened to them in the trafficking situation. There's layers upon layers of harm that's been done to them over, often since childhood. And I think this is something that's often sort of forgotten. And in fact, really good for the healthcare professionals amongst us. Stolen Smiles was 2012, I think, Kathy Zimmerman. She is the first study looking at health issues in trafficking victims. There have been others since, but this is still really interesting study, and really easy reading. And she said, and she noted that high levels of violence were experienced by women before trafficking, we've also got to look at any conditions that are linked to poverty, whether we're talking malnutrition or sort of poor healthcare conditions. So people have not had vaccinations, for example, or they've not had their diabetes treated, whatever it is, or disabilities. People are vulnerable, they're trafficked. When we see them in our surgeries, they have vulnerabilities because they have experienced abuse during trafficking, but also they've got the original disabilities potentially. We also know now for a lot of the child sexual abuse work or child abuse work that previous abuse creates vulnerability to further abuse. There's increasing amounts of evidence showing that's the case. No, still got to get back to Mother Clara. So, we touched on it already, but some of those other things that make people vulnerable. So, the family could be implicit in the trafficking or sold, or it's a stigma. So, the Albanian women we see who have they've been sent off to uni, they're very educated, from middle-class families, sent off to uni, get a boyfriend. That wasn't in the father's plan for the daughter, because she wants to marry the boyfriend now and not the person that's been chosen by the father, so cast out from the family, becomes vulnerable. Sometimes it's the boyfriend that met at uni that's the groomer and is going to traffic them, and they've got her in that position of vulnerability deliberately. Sometimes it's just unfortunate. So forced marriage, any form of domestic violence, any people that have been, women that have been sexually assaulted in countries where that involves being cast out from the family, marriage prospects no good, off they go. So they're isolated, they're vulnerable. Loss of family members, I think, after the Nepalese earthquake, frightening numbers of people trafficked after that. Any sorts of community violence. A lot of our people have fled various wars or LGBT abuse. A lot of our people have been enslaved as children. One of the saddest things that happens to me is a Bangladeshi man. Well, it's an argument about whether he was from India or Bangladesh. He thought he was born in Bangladesh, but he was moved, he was sold by somebody. He was working on the rubbish dumps when he was 8 years old with a little sort of in an Oliver Twist type situation, really. Then he was sold to somebody who took him to India when he was when he was a bit older. He was forced to work in restaurants, sleeping on the floor for scraps of food, and then in the building sites, and then he was trafficked here. And all the way along, he was being sexually abused by the people around him and physically abused. And one of the things he said to me, he said, "I just thought my life was unfortunate. I didn't realise this was wrong. I thought I was just one of the unlucky ones." So this whole idea, people that have been brought up almost as slaves as children don't even understand that this is wrong. State torture, persecution. As I said, it's not just poverty, it's but there's always a specific vulnerability. So healthcare concerns. How many, just as a matter of interest, how many healthcare professionals have we in the room? Oh, quite a lot then. Okay, so I will dwell on this a little bit then. So we all know, as healthcare professionals, that physical and psychological things are very entwined. I would say in this group of people, they're incredibly deeply entwined. We've got I'm going to whiz through some of the issues that we see, or the sort of categories. So the physical health issues, so let's see, the things that we see. Again, these little titles, I'm going to dwell a little bit more, if I can get the arrow working. So direct physical violence. So some of the things we see are injuries from just direct physical violence. So I see people that have been beaten, stabbed, they've been restrained, they've been cut, they've been any sorts of physical things that you can imagine, resulting in fractures, unhealed fractures, sprains of all sorts, ligament damage, lots of dental and facial injuries, cigarette burns, scalds, dripping wax dropped on people, hot oil poured over them, and then lots of head injuries. Sorry.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but how do you meet these people?
Oh, sorry, the Helen Bamber Foundation.
So they're only being rescued by the time you find them?
Absolutely, yes. So we're a clinical care organisation, so we're looking after victims. Most of them have been referred to us by police, GPs, healthcare, and most of them solicitors.
I've even got to see a GP. I work in A&E and I'm a midwife, and those people aren't allowed to come in and get the help.
I'm going to talk a lot about that. You're going to be here all night.
Yeah. I was just wondering, how do you find them?
No. So what I'm seeing very much, but I think this is very interesting as well, though, because we're doing a lot of training, and I'm part of another group that's going in training GPs and A&E doctors, and the focus is very much on identification, and I think that is very, very important, obviously, but it's also probably, as a GP in this country, for example, you will see more people that are established survivors. Let's call them survivors at that point. They're survivors of trafficking. So, and again, it's really important to know the sort of physical injuries you will see. It's not just about identification, it's about how you work with these people afterwards, what sort of things to expect. So, but yeah, that's how I see them. So I'm very much a very small, a very sort of niche thing. So head injuries, so everybody has a headache, often stress related, but it might not be. So many people, head beaten against the wall, loads of episodes of loss of consciousness, very easy in a medical setting to blame stress, but actually nobody's, but it's really important to look beyond that. So a lot of post-concussional type syndromes and post-traumatic epilepsy. I think from my medical student days, is it about 0.4% of the population have epilepsy. In the population we see at Helen Bambus, that's torture and trafficking victims, it's up to 4%, and particularly the temporal lobe type epilepsies or the focal epilepsies. And cognitive impairments. And again, that's very difficult to work out because we have a lot of people who seem very cognitively impaired. We're not sure whether that is a psychiatric thing, is that the sort of severe depression, PTSD type thing? Is it learning difficulties, which was their original vulnerability maybe? Is it lack of education? The Afghan man I saw the other day had 6 months of education in his entire life, so doesn't act in the way that we might expect, can't read, can't write in his own language, let alone ours. So these are the sort of slightly tricky things that we're seeing. So the physical effects of sexual abuse, I probably don't need to run through them too much, but we've got, obviously a lot of non-specific pelvic and lower abdominal pain, and vaginal issues, bleeding, pain, irregular painful menstruation, STIs, as we're talking about, particularly the bloodborne viruses, and often those that haven't been treated well at all. So we're seeing, secondary, tertiary syphilis, for example, lots of pelvic infections and physical tearing cuts. I had one woman who'd been, she'd been in a sort of underground brothel in London for 7 years, and there was one particular man that visited her every week, and he just used to pull one of her labia, and so it was sort of like 8 inches long, and it was horrendous for her because that was a constant reminder of what was happening for her. We had one woman, we had several women recently with vaginal fistulas, history, all sorts of, you're a midwife, so there's a whole selection of sort of reproductive health type things, so the histories of abortion, forced abortions, infertility resulting in that, there's the pregnancy itself, there's maybe not been quite clear where the children are, so there's a whole lot of sort of issues there, and then obviously the sequelae of multiple anal rapes, fissures, tags, bleeding, pain. Do you think so, and then what I call the consequences of captivity neglect, so untreated chronic medical conditions, or untreated physical injuries, malnourishment, vitamin deficiencies, TB, we see quite a bit, other sorts of skin, chest infections and skin infections. And the environmental work-related injuries, I think you mentioned it before, I just sort of think, imagine what happens if you take away all health and safety rules. Much as sometimes we hate health and safety, they're there for a reason. So we see so many physical injuries because of that, burns or lacerations, fractures, lots of musculoskeletal pain from construction work, or fractures from falling off buildings, domestic servitude, often living just on a very thin mattress in a cupboard and forced to sort of work for sort of 18 hours a day, so lots of sort of musculoskeletal problems, and the heat, cold and light exposure, so the often quite young boys, often the Vietnamese who are in the cannabis factories, who have 24 hours a day exposure to the heat and light, so that gives them incredibly sore eyes and all sorts of infectious diseases that sort of run fairly rampant and that sort of thing, and chemical exposures of all sorts. I had one of my patients had been forced to work for 3 years in a car wash, and but no protective clothing, so if you see somebody working in a car wash and they've not got good sturdy shoes or boots on, they're not wearing gloves. He had this guy practically degloving injured his hands because of the strong chemicals he was using, and gradually it was the most awful case of dermatitis really I'd seen, the skin peeling off, and trench foot from his feet. He was also malnourished. He had been eating. He was given rice to eat once a day and once a week a tin of tomatoes. He was kept locked in a caravan except when he was at work, 14 hours a day in a car wash, and once a week they got a tin of tomatoes. So he had all sorts of vitamin deficiencies and malnourishments. So we see a few weird and wonderful things, so chemical injuries, the skin lightening creams, for example, branding, tattooing, hormonal. I've seen people who have been left one particular woman I remember who was orphaned in China. She was taken in by the local brothel and she was allowed to sweep the floor until they decided that actually they wanted her to be a bit more useful, so they gave her hormones, so she speeded up through puberty so she could actually work in prostitution there. Got another Chinese lady who was forced to undergo boob implants. She had her eyebrows tattooed, perfect little rosebud mouth and a nose job, all to make her look more Western for the clients in the brothel. Substance abuse, you can imagine, is fairly common, and it is very common amongst our clients, as are psychosomatic illnesses. Mental health concerns, so we've got depression, anxiety, PTSD, complex PTSD. I don't think that's a great surprise to anybody, and just the list of the symptoms that we see. Again, I'll whiz through that because I think it's fairly self-explanatory. Do you know what we mean by complex? There's a psychologist in the room for sure. Any psychiatrists? Because I'll have to be quiet if there are. So complex PTSD. I've been working in general practice for years and I've not really heard this term. I think it's a really useful term. The psychiatrists, you know how they love their classification systems with DSM and ICD and things. They've been arguing about it for decades as well. But it's come out of child abuse work. This idea that it's almost like a personality change. And in fact, in ICD-11 this year, it's finally coming. They're not calling it complex personality disorder. They're calling it something. They're calling it enduring personality disorder, something or other. But it's basically a really interesting concept and works. I think really any of us who are going to be working with victims or survivors of trafficking, this is about people that have been exposed to chronic, repetitive trauma. And it sort of really gives you this idea of a loss of sense of trust in people around you, a loss of sense of safety, you're never safe, and a loss of self-worth. You have just been treated as a slave your entire life. Everything you know has been taken away from you. You have been controlled for however long you've been controlled for. You have no self-worth, and it creates you can't trust people, you can't trust medical professions, you don't trust your solicitor, you don't trust the authorities, you definitely don't trust the Home Office or the police. But it is, it's just incredibly difficult to trust people. We also see the other side of that, where it's a sort of problem with all sorts of relationships. It's a sort of relationship bonding issue that on one hand they don't trust, on the other hand they overtrust. They're so desperate to be safe, so they overtrust. So, hence they're very vulnerable afterwards to being rescued by their rescuer boyfriend or whatever it is, because they don't have a sense of a normal relationship. So loss of identity and agency. So I find it difficult to walk along to my GP surgery or turn up to A&E and ask to be seen or whatever. It's difficult for any of us to do those little things. My 20-year-old, is just learning to stand up for self to do it. We've all learnt those things, and that sometimes you have to. People that have been through these experiences, they really can't cope with anything. So they go into a GP surgery and ask to register in broken English, and somebody says, I don't understand you, or you need a passport, and they run out. They're never going to go back there. That's their one-off chance. And these are really important things. Not being able to imagine a future, inappropriate risk-taking, so hence quite a lot of the substance abuse, or doing things that we wouldn't, or unsafe sex. There's a whole range of subjects that comes under that, and somatization. So just sort of this slide I'm just sort of throwing in here, but because we're talking a little bit about the psychiatric or the mental health sort of things, the pre-trafficking vulnerability. So it's again, this is about why people stay in these controlled sort of things. It's about the control mechanism. So they're vulnerable already. Debt bondage. So debt bondage again. I had no idea. So when they're told, well, actually now you owe me £3,000, not 500, so you have to be, you have to work to pay me back. Now I would just sort of think, hey, you're a nasty person, I'm running off, that's not fair. But for people, particularly in the Southeast Asian cultures, a debt and not paying back a debt is a huge sin against the family and the community. So people are really held in this debt bondage. But the manipulation of personal relationships, so this idea of the trickery, so it's, I love you, if you loved me, you would sleep with all these men I'm going to bring to my flat. So it's this and that goes back to what I was saying earlier about this real sort of confusion about what a normal relationship is. And people find it very difficult. People have been deceived all the time. They find and betrayed all the time. As I said, this lack of trust. And just to be aware that you've been sold is just, it's just devastating. And I think that one of the things so many people say to me as well, the guilt and the sort of self-blame they have, that they were tricked and they fell for these things. So it's a really strong thing. And you'll see in a minute, it's all part of why they find it very difficult to say, hey, I need help, please help me. Juju, you touched on witchcraft and juju ceremonies. It's quite a few of our people, particularly from Eastern Africa, who have been, but not exclusively, have been forced to undergo juju ceremonies, and this sort of belief in this is incredibly strong. And one of the first people I saw, actually, she had to undergo this ceremony, and she was told that if she tried to escape, she would bleed to death, and they'd taken a sample of her blood. And she was absolutely terrified about the nosebleed she was having. And I could not understand, despite seeing her several times, why she was so terrified about these nosebleeds. And it was months later when this whole juju ceremony came out and her real underlying fears. These are just some really good bits of clinical research. If anybody's interested, it's a Stolen Smile study and the 2016 one from Orem et al. At King's. This also, sort of reinforces 45% of people who were trafficked had chronic medical conditions, and also how long their symptoms last. So 78% of women, 40% of men had symptoms of PTSD, severe depression or anxiety, still present 16 months after escape. Lots of ongoing injuries and STIs and pregnancies. So that's all not part of that. So post-trafficking vulnerability, so people remain vulnerable, as we've said, partly because they will, once they're in this country, they're going through our system, they are very likely to be in a very almost destitute situation, so they're vulnerable again. They're isolated, their original community they've come from, even if they're foul, even if they're offered repatriation, they feel they cannot go back to that country because of the experiences they've been through. Lots of the very complex legal issues, the lack of autonomy and agency I've talked about, the fear, ongoing control, and the threats and reprisals, as you mentioned, often directed to family at home. And the sort of vulnerability to further abuse, the domestic violence in survival relationships. Often we see the client that's has realised the person's doing it out of not through choice, will help them escape, but then very odd sort of situations, and they fall into these relationships which are also very unsafe. Can't help but mention immigration detention. So many trafficking people have gone through immigration detention, which compounds the problem, and also prisons are often found with false documents, which is now imprisonable for. So, and all of these things increase vulnerability, and obviously they have their ongoing medical conditions, the results of the abuse that they've experienced.
Sorry, we've got about 10 minutes left. So
Yeah, there's not going to be a lot of time for questions.
No,
But,
I was just thinking maybe if we
But
could
we
wrap up in
are
the next
coming
few
to an
minutes.
end of the bits I really want you to know. So the healthcare barriers. So I think this is really, a lot of what I've said is leading up to this. It's why people find it so difficult to engage here. So there's this, what I call intrinsic factors, so the thing, and extrinsic factors. So the intrinsic factors, a lot of those things I've talked about, the stigma, shame, the lack of agency, the loss of agency and trust. So all those things we've talked about, or substance misuse, all of those things. But also, we're also looking at the extrinsic things. Our services are really not geared up to dealing with people like this. Very few people on the front line know much about it. Certainly those that are maybe in triaging, in whether it's a GP receptionist or triage in A&E, or so it's very much about trying to get some training into people. We're talking again about the entitlement to healthcare. I know you've had Dots of the World come to talk to you. Recognised trafficking victims are entitled to healthcare, but those that actually go through the NRM, which we'll hopefully have 30 seconds on later, are few and far between, and there's a lot of others living in a different sort of situation. And interpreting services and sustained funding, all those things that you can imagine. So I think that it's really important to know how very difficult it is for people to walk through the door in a healthcare setting, to start getting treatment for anything maybe more physical, but then to tell their story about what's really behind things, it's even more difficult. So, silly arrow, come on. So again, this is more of what I was talking about before. We can whiz through that. So, everybody wants to know, how do we know if someone's being trafficked? And it's not easy. As healthcare professionals, we're trained in domestic violence, and I talk about it very much like domestic violence. There's lots of little clues that you just pick up on, and also how you manage somebody that you suspect. Again, like domestic violence, you offer the listening ear, you offer your open door, you try to separate from any partner that might be with them, you don't overact, you use your trauma-informed ways of working. You know you might not be able to rescue immediately, but you let people know it's a safe place to come whenever they want to. So as Catherine said, there's many different indicator lists. Some of them are very medical. Statutory, we've just been writing the statutory guidance for the Modern Slavery Act and for the Home Office, and there's a whole list of medical indicators in there that we've been working really hard on with the NHS Modern Slavery team. So I'm hoping they will be a better set of indicators that are coming up just medically. But a lot of things we've talked about, just so in a medical situation, it's obviously physical appearance, those that look malnourished or unkempt, they're dressed inappropriately, they're never on their own.
Some of them look absolutely gorgeous. And
absolutely.
healthy, as well.
Yeah, absolutely, because they're looked after when they are attending things, which is why it's so difficult to sort of say it, but it's often the control, the person accompanying, I think, is often the real sort of clue. Or I had my old practice where I used to work rang me. One of the receptionists had noted that there was a young girl who'd just come in to see the nurse, probably 17, 18, wasn't quite sure, said she was 19, but she was living at an address that was registered to about 10 other similar age girls. So she picked up on that as a receptionist, which was brilliant.
Yeah.
So often they don't really know where they are. I hate to talk about documents, but they might not quite have the right documents. And that whole sort of body language thing, the reluctance to seek help, the lack of eye contact. So it's a whole huge topic, but it's just sort of worth knowing. So what do you do if you're in your A&E department, your GP surgery, you've had all these red flags, these indicators, you are a little bit concerned. And as I said, think safeguarding, but think vulnerabilities, think your domestic violence training, which is as close to it as you can get. So keep it at the back. We all ought to be keeping it at the back of our minds. Give yourself time to think, discuss with your colleagues, work in a trauma-informed way with people. You know, be empathetic. Phil Brewer, who's the head of SCA7 in the Met or he was for trafficking and kids, and he used to have said when he's doing sort of police raids, he teaches his officers that the very first contact you have with somebody will determine whether they go on to seek help or whether they just disappear off underground again. So it's every single consultation, every single contact, be kind, empathetic, nice, keep your door open. So try to separate with people accompanying. You know, we know our little tricks that we've got for that. You want a blood test or an X-ray, or this is our rules, or I don't have any choice, I have to have a proper interpreter. You get a good interpreter. Make sure people understand our duty of confidentiality, because people have often come from places that they don't understand confidentiality. And think of excuses to bring the patient back, whether you're A&E, you can do that, GPs, you can do that, midwives, you know, just think of excuses, what you can't. If you think it's obviously it's a child, it's a different matter, you've got to talk, you know, you might be thinking, if you're really concerned that under 18, you might be thinking a 999 call, you're certainly going to be talking safeguarding. Most of the time you're not going to be in that acute situation. Always think about safeguarding pathways. So the pathway that has been devised for this is that healthcare professionals will refer to their safeguarding lead. Their safeguarding lead will refer up the tree to the adult or child social care safeguarding lead. There is a slight problem with that, and this is my massive issue, is that so many of the safeguarding leads are not trained. We're doing our best efforts to train people. There is now modern slavery safeguarding network, which is the highest of the modern slavery of the safeguarding leads, and the idea is they're disseminating this information everywhere. So it should start to happen.
I'm not really sure if trusts are this robust about what you're talking about. I mean, if a child came in, I know that I'd get an excellent response, and they would say just admit them, and we just admit them for some reason, whatever reason you want, and they just inform the registrar, no problem. But if any of us walked in and I'm saying, oh yeah, I'm really concerned about that lady, and they say, well, is she saying anything? And I'll say, well, probably not, because you just said they don't open up. No. I'm not really sure if I get this robust response. I have to go back to work and have a look, but I don't think I get this response.
It's really, really difficult, because we're at very early stages of awakening the healthcare models. But I have trained between myself and two colleagues, we've trained Imperial Trust, King's Trust, Newham A&E, so many of the GPs, safeguarding GPs. I'm at a conference on Thursday for all the primary care safeguarding leads. So it's beginning to happen. It's now core stuff on safeguarding syllabuses. So you will begin to start, but I completely agree. One of my colleagues who I'm doing a lot of training with, has been until very recently an A&E doctor at King's. I had a very classic case of could have been 17, could have been 19, could have been 22-year-old. Doesn't matter, no. But she told everybody she was 20, so it wasn't a child safeguarding issue. As you say, the response would have been immediate. So it was an adult safeguarding issue, and she had to beat herself against a brick wall.
I've been there, the police are involved, and when you say please look after that person, they say, well, we'll follow them wherever they take them and find the whole house of all these girls, but then you come back to you and say we lost them.
It might be harder perhaps for the younger ones, but it's routine that we admit what's safeguard. There's medical admitting teams.
They have to be over 60 or something like that, or have learning difficulties. Honestly, anybody in this room, I would struggle. I would have to come up with an excuse or really wait down on a reason.
And one of the awful things, of course, at the moment is, all healthcare systems are under so much pressure. I mean, there is now, we've written a spiel about safeguarding that's now on the RCGP website, which is under safeguarding, so this is massively in the safeguarding realm. But it is, we were absolutely told when we met the head of the RCGP that the BMA, the RCN would all push back if we were given more work to do, because everybody is under so much pressure, and there are no beds anywhere anyway. So it is, it is a very, very difficult situation, but hopefully it is improving. So Modern Slavery Helpline, well, there are several, but this is the classic thing that people can self-refer to, or just get help, or just talk through with people if it's still existing.
Yeah.
Which is
Funding
another,
crisis
yeah,
at the
there's
moment.
funding crisis in that. So there we go, that's it. So this is my reading list here if you're interested. Loads and loads of lovely, interesting things. The Trafficking Survivor Care Standards, really interesting for anybody who's working in any setting at all where you might come in contact with victims or survivors of trafficking. It's written, for medics, for safe house workers, for anybody, and it's actually a really good read-ish. I have to say that. And the trauma, I wrote some of it. So the trauma-informed code of conduct as well. There's a lot of talk about working in a trauma-informed way. My colleague Rachel, who you know is our head of counter-trafficking, and Katie Robgent, who is our ex-head of therapists, has done loads of work in Rwanda and DRC, working with very traumatised individuals. They've come up, it's really short, but it's a really amazing bit of work to make us all understand what it means to work in a trauma-informed way without the very complex psychological speak, and also real practical things like trying to create the illusion of time in our busy working lives. And I urge you just to have a quick look at it. It's on our website.
We're out of time, but we will post a list of resources. So we'll post a video on the Take Action part of the association website, and we'll also post a list of resources. And if there are any other resources that you think might be worthwhile, I know people will have to go in a minute, but if there's maybe we can just take 5 quick minutes. And I don't know, I think we've lost most people. We've got one person left online. But if anybody has any last questions or...
What about when if you suspect someone in a real world, like not in real world on the streets, or just in your day-to-day?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question actually, and the police is the obvious answer. And there are, for example, the Gangmasters Association have put some things together. So there's now an app that is readily downloadable, and if people are worried about their car wash because it's such a big problem, you can just sort of report on the app. And I think the police and the Gangmasters Association, or whatever they call it, are trying to work together with a few more things like that. But if you're suspicious of something you see on the street and you're concerned, it's police.
But then you have this risk, of course, of reporting someone that could then be put into detention and mistreated rather than
Absolutely.
assisted.
And we haven't mentioned NRM.
Yeah.
So the official,
And I totally agree, and that's why as the Red Cross we don't offer much advice, unfortunately, about what to do if you do spot somebody on the street, just because we are really concerned about referring to the authorities, only because you're right, if people are undocumented or people are, and unfortunately the current situation is the authorities will treat somebody as an undocumented migrant before they recognise them as a person who's been trafficked. So it is a real struggle for us. So we're kind of a bit, unfortunately, quiet on that, just because we don't have a better solution. The Modern Slavery Helpline is there. They collect intelligence. Once they get enough information about a situation, they can refer to the authorities. That might be an option, depending on the setting. If it's safe for you to talk to the person. A colleague of mine was having her nails done, and had the opportunity to start talking to somebody, and she was on leave, but then suddenly went back into work mode to give him, just to check. But she assessed the situation was safe. The person managing the place wasn't there. It's always going to be a struggle. But yeah, definitely, if there's immediate harm, the police are there.
Could you just say what MRN or whatever it was stands for?
National Referral Mechanism.
Okay.
So it's the official way of recognising victims of trafficking in this country. So in theory, victims of trafficking are supposed to be referred into the NRM. They are given a decision quite quickly about whether they are a a potential victim of trafficking, and then they have certain entitlements, so they can have basically it's all run by Salvation Army at the moment, and they sort of have contracted out to various groups that will give them either a safe house, outreach work, and some money. It's very, in theory, it's very short-lived. One of the things I know is it takes decades for people often to get over this, and I think that it's like 45 days rest and reflection period, which is no time at all. You then get a conclusive grounds decision, which may be positive. If you're positive, you're then a recognised victim of trafficking. Now that might or might not come with, say, a year's asylum, a year of indefinite leave to remain, or it might not. You know, you might be officially a victim of trafficking, but it's decided that it's safe to go back to your own country or whatever it is. So it's very complicated. It's basically a legal thing. It's tied up with immigration. It's tied up with Home Office. There's moves afoot to make healthcare professionals, sort of frontline, sort of first responders as they call them at the moment, safeguarding social services is, and that's, in my view, how it should stay, because this is not our job. It's incredibly complicated, and it's a legal proceeding, and it has huge implications for people. So, anything else you want to say on that?
No, I think that's right. Yeah.
So it's some of the situation, the what to do situation is a bit of a mess, but it is getting better. So we are where we were with domestic abuse sort of 15 years ago or so, I would say. And the police are in the same situation as us. There's some amazing good pockets of knowledge and training, but they are under huge difficulties as well.
Have domestic violence deaths just gone up last year?
Yeah.
Have we just gone backwards?
Yeah, I'm sure we probably have, but is that austerity generally creating more stress out there for people, and the lack of policing and police response, and maybe medical response as well, because again we're all too busy to do the things that we know we should do.
Just one more question. Have you ever come across, like, for example, generations, a child born into slavery? Have you come across cases like that?
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I haven't, because I see people in an escape situation. We do everything we can to protect them, but we absolutely know it happens.
But you're not seeing any women coming in with children who have been born, for instance, or they've been here?
Oh yes,
Or
oh yes,
grown up,
yeah.
Grown up, like they were born to parents who were slaves, and they were told, you also have to be.
I haven't seen that, but I'm sure that happens. What I see, particularly because we have a very strong mother and baby group at Helen Bamber Foundation, and that's now its own charity in its own right, and I'm working quite a lot with one of the safeguarding midwives from King's about this as well. So we absolutely know we're getting people that are coming over pregnant and actually maybe being trafficked here, and then the children sort of, maybe they have the baby, full on healthcare, 6 weeks after the baby's born, mother and child disappear. So we're sort of a bit worried about a certain sort of like trafficking ring there, what's happening to these babies. But yes, a lot of the work we do, we have women with babies that have been a product of the trafficking situation, or they've been a product of exploitative situations or survival relationships afterwards, or they've been the product of very good relationships afterwards. And obviously the challenge there is to really help these people sort of assimilate, because you've obviously got the adverse childhood events, and these people, our women are living, destitute situations under huge psychological stress with very little support and all of the things we've been talking about. So it's very difficult for them to bring the children up.
We're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid. Thank you very much, both of you, for coming, and thank you all for coming as well, and to people who were online and who are no longer online. Just a couple of quick things. So we will have this posted if you want to share it with other association members or other people in the staff. We will have it online, so people can watch it. I don't really don't.
MSF people as well.
Sorry?
Can you share it with people outside?
Yeah, it's on the associative section, so it's password protected, but if you were to watch it with them,
Oh.
that would probably be fine.
I can provide a link.
We will have, it is password protected though.
Yeah.
Yeah, so just a couple of things that are coming up. So in about 3 weeks' time we will have our next meeting. Everyone's welcome, as usual. We are looking to do some, there will be some events that will be coming up focusing on the entitlement to healthcare in association with a number of other organisations. Toward the end of October there's going to be quite a bit of work, I think, around this, and we will be looking for people to come out and kind of mobilise, and it'll be like demonstration type stuff. So spread the word, keep it on your radar, we will send out emails.
It's going to be an action of some sort, we're not entirely certain yet.
We'll know more after tomorrow.
Hopefully, yeah.
There's a planning meeting tomorrow. And the other thing that we're currently working on is there's been, as you've probably been following, search and rescue. So MSF started up search and rescue again in the Mediterranean a few weeks ago. It's been kind of a continual battle trying to disembark people, and it's really a completely ad hoc process. So people are kept in limbo on the boat waiting to get off, and then so far there's been a solution generally in a relatively short period of time, but there's just no consistency, no continuity to it. MSF is kind of ramping up some campaigning around this issue of having a sustainable disembarkation mechanism, which is going to be quite hard to achieve, obviously. But we are hopefully going to be participating in kind of a broader campaign, and that will also be taking place over the course of the next few weeks, because there is kind of a big motion that will be coming up in the European Parliament, and we will be kind of gearing toward that. Interestingly, some of the people who are probably more active on the committees that are involved in that are people like Anne Widdecombe, we all know is a big fan of migrants and refugees. So anyway, there's a lot of work to be done, probably in contacting MPs and petitions and MEPs. So we will also be contacting you about that. And please, if you see it, please share it and get people mobilized. Thank you again for coming, and thank you both very much.